If you are hearing this, my voice is all that remains, and the grand design I spent 22 years building has finally begun. Julian, you are likely in my study right now, calculating this home's value before my body is even cold. You think you won when the ocean took Clara, but I built this empire in the dark, and your 30 days have officially begun.
This was the heartbreaking, hidden reality of Arthur Vance's final moments on Earth. He was a man who built a legendary $40 billion fortune, but died in absolute painful isolation, with only the sound of the Atlantic waves crashing against the cliffs outside his window. He knew that the moment his eyes closed forever, his own flesh and blood would celebrate his passing as a financial victory, rather than grieve the loss of a father. Arthur spent his last years harboring a secret so heavy it nearly broke him, watching his greedy son Julian dismantle everything they had built together. The depth of this betrayal goes far beyond simple family greed, stretching into a decades-long game of chess where every piece was moved with cold mathematical precision. To the outside world, Arthur Vance was an enigma, a ghost, in the high-stakes world of global finance. He didn't live in a sprawling penthouse in Manhattan, and he never hosted lavish parties on the coast of France. He chose instead to reside in a modest, windswept stone home on the rugged, unforgiving cliffs of Maine. He drove a 10-year-old sedan, wore simple wool coats, and spoke in a quiet, measured tone that commanded respect without ever needing to raise his voice. But behind this unassuming facade lay a mind of unmatched mathematical genius. While the public saw a quiet retiree, the global financial system felt the silent, heavy gravity of his unseen assets. He was a man who believed that true wealth was a shield, not a crown. When the safe deposit box was opened 3 days after Arthur's quiet funeral, it did not contain a typical legal will or a list of beloved family heirlooms to be shared among relatives. Instead, the lawyers pulled out a single, military-grade encrypted ledger that unlocked a hidden network of private trusts, offshore bank accounts, and vast land holdings worth over $42 billion. The revelation shocked the financial world, but the real shockwave hit when the lawyers read the name of the sole beneficiary of this unimaginable empire. Arthur had bypassed his ambitious son Julian entirely, leaving every single asset to his stepdaughter Clara, a brilliant young woman who had officially been declared dead after her sailboat vanished in the Caribbean in 1996. The room fell into a suffocating silence as Julian realized he was expected to hand over his entire life to a ghost. How does a man hide a $40 billion empire from his own family while living like an ordinary, middle-class retiree in a small coastal town? What truly happened on that stormy night in the Caribbean when Clara's sailboat supposedly went under, leaving no trace of her body for the search teams to find? And most importantly, how far would Julian go to protect his position once he realized his father had spent 20 years setting a brilliant trap to destroy him from beyond the grave? These are the questions that would unravel a carefully constructed web of corporate greed, hidden wealth, and psychological warfare. The story of the Vance family is a masterclass in how the pursuit of money can completely destroy the sacred bond of family, leaving nothing but ashes and cold, calculated revenge in its wake. But before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. To truly understand the collapse of the Vance dynasty, we have to look back to the early 1980s, when Arthur Vance was a rising star in the competitive world of New England commercial real estate. Arthur was a man of quiet intelligence, a mathematical genius who believed that true power belonged to those who remained completely invisible to the public eye. He watched other developers brag about their wealth in newspapers and buy flashy yachts, while he quietly purchased thousands of acres of undervalued land through obscure corporate entities. Arthur believed that wealth was a shield to protect his family, but he never expected that shield would eventually become a weapon. As the decades progressed, the divide between Arthur's two children became an unbridgeable chasm. His biological son, Julian, was a boy who measured his worth entirely by the envy of others. If a classmate had a premium watch, Julian demanded one twice as expensive. As he entered adulthood, this hunger only intensified. Julian viewed his father's quiet, invisible approach to wealth not as wisdom, but as an embarrassing, outdated limitation. He wanted the world to know the name Vance. He wanted to walk into five-star restaurants and have the room fall silent. He wanted to see his face on the covers of major business magazines. He wanted the noise, the flash, and the immediate gratification of modern high society. Arthur watched his son's growing vanity with a deep, silent concern. He tried on countless occasions to teach Julian the art of patience, taking him out to the desolate coastal lands he bought in the north. Arthur would stand on the cold, rocky soil and say, "The ground beneath your feet doesn't need to make noise to have value. It just needs to remain yours." But Julian would only stare at his expensive leather shoes, ruined by the mud, wishing he were back in the city. He didn't want to hold land for 30 years. He wanted to flip it in 30 days. He didn't understand that the quietest rivers always run the deepest. Then came Clara. When Arthur married Clara's mother, a quiet academic who sadly passed away just a few years later, Clara remained in the Vance home. She was a quiet, highly observant girl who spent her weekends lost in massive books on international trade, maritime law, and advanced financial modeling. While Julian was out spending his inheritance on fast sports cars and high society clubs, Clara was sitting on the floor of Arthur's study, helping him organize the thousands of deeds, tax structures, and trust documents that made up the unseen Vance empire. She possessed a natural affinity for numbers, seeing patterns where others saw only chaos. Arthur saw in Clara the daughter he had always dreamed of, a brilliant, disciplined mind who understood that true power is never loud. Clara possessed an instinctual grasp of numbers that rivaled Arthur's own. Together, in the quiet glow of the study's single brass lamp, they created a shorthand language of financial codes, mapping out the complex flow of capital across global markets. Julian watched this growing bond with a bitter, toxic resentment. He felt like an outsider in his own family, a prince being pushed aside by a quiet, bookish intruder. He began to see Clara not as a sister, but as a dangerous rival who threatened his birthright. The stage was set for a betrayal that would alter the course of their lives forever. By the early 1990s, Julian had risen to the position of junior partner in the family's public-facing real estate firm. But the steady, conservative returns of Arthur's business were far too slow for Julian's grand ambitions. He wanted to play in the high-stakes world of international venture capital, where fortunes were made and lost in a single afternoon. Behind his father's back, Julian began networking with aggressive offshore brokers, looking for high-leverage opportunities that promised to double his capital overnight. He was blind to the risks, blinded by his own burning desire to surpass his father's shadow. To fund these massive, risky bets, Julian began utilizing a dangerous financial tool: corporate lines of credit secured by the family's historic land holdings. He forged signatures, manipulated internal memos, and bypassed the traditional board approvals. At first, his trades were successful, giving him the illusion of absolute genius. He bought a sprawling estate in the hills of Connecticut, imported exotic vehicles, and threw lavish weekend parties designed to secure his status among the global elite. He believed he was finally proving his father wrong. He believed he was the true visionary of the family, destined to lead them into a new era of global dominance. But the illusion did not last. In the winter of 1995, a sudden and massive shift in the Asian currency markets sent shockwaves through the global financial system. Overnight, the highly leveraged investments Julian had made began to collapse like a house of cards. The offshore margin calls were brutal, demanding immediate, massive payments to keep his positions afloat. Terrified of public humiliation, bankruptcy, and his father's cold, disappointed wrath, Julian made a fatal decision. He initiated a series of unauthorized, highly complex wire transfers from the company's primary cash reserves directly into his private trading accounts. He convinced himself that it was a temporary loan, that the market would recover, he would pay back the funds, and no one would ever be the wiser. But the market didn't recover. The currency continued to plummet, dragging his investments deeper into the red. Within 90 days, Julian had lost over $45 million of the company's core capital. The deficit was a ticking time bomb, a massive financial black hole sitting quietly in the corporate ledger, waiting for someone to look closely enough to see it. Julian worked feverishly to cover his tracks, creating fake invoices and shifting debts between shell companies, praying that his father's hands-off approach would protect him. That someone was Clara. As the chief auditor of the family's private holding companies, Clara noticed a series of irregular, recurring administration fees being paid to a shell company registered in the Cayman Islands. The transactions were cleverly disguised as routine marketing and consulting expenses, but Clara's sharp mathematical mind immediately noticed that the transaction codes did not match the company's internal security protocols. She knew the company's books inside and out, and this small irregularity was a thread she was determined to pull. She spent 3 sleepless nights tracing the digital path of the funds, navigating through layers of offshore bank accounts and shell registries until she finally reached the source: Julian's private stock trading accounts. The depth of the embezzlement was staggering. It wasn't just a mistake or a temporary lapse in judgment. It was a deliberate, systematic stripping of the company's lifeblood that put the entire Vance legacy at risk of a federal investigation. Clara sat in the quiet of her office, the weight of the discovery pressing down on her chest. On a freezing Tuesday evening, Clara walked into Julian's private executive suite. She shut the heavy oak door behind her, locking it with a soft click, and placed a thick, leather-bound folder on his desk. Julian, who was pouring himself a glass of expensive whiskey, looked up with his signature smug smile. "Still working late, Clara? You really should get out more, enjoy the finer things in life," he sneered, gesturing to his lavishly decorated office. Clara did not smile. She opened the folder, revealing the exact wire transfer receipts, the Cayman Island Shell Company registry, and the devastating trail of his lost $45 million. The smile vanished from Julian's face, replaced by a cold, pale panic. Clara looked him directly in the eyes, her voice steady and quiet. "You have exactly 72 hours to confess to Arthur, resign your position, and agree to a structured plan to repay the funds. If you do not, I will personally present this file to Arthur and the federal regulators." Julian was backed into a corner, knowing that if his father discovered the truth, he would be permanently written out of the family will and potentially face federal charges. He pretended to agree to Clara's terms, suggesting they take a private weekend sailing trip on the Meridian, Clara's beloved sailboat, to discuss how to transition his duties smoothly and break the news to Arthur gently. What happened out on those dark Caribbean waters remains one of the most chilling mysteries of the entire case. Julian returned to the harbor alone 18 hours later, telling the local Coast Guard a tragic story of a sudden, violent tropical squall that had knocked him unconscious below deck. He claimed that when he finally woke up, the boat was rapidly taking on water, and Clara had vanished into the pitch-black waves, leaving behind only her floating life vest. The Meridian was a sleek, 38-foot classic sailing yacht that Arthur had gifted to Clara on her 25th birthday. It was her sanctuary, the one place where she could escape the heavy, tense atmosphere of the Vance family and feel completely free. On that fateful Friday evening in the late summer of 1996, the yacht sailed out of the quiet harbor in Maine, heading south toward the deep, open, and treacherous waters of the Atlantic. The sky was a deep navy blue, but the air felt heavy and charged with static. The weather forecast had predicted clear skies, but as they reached the deep waters, a sudden, unpredicted low-pressure system rolled in from the east, bringing with it heavy black clouds and a biting, freezing wind. The waves began to swell, tossing the wooden hull of the Meridian like a toy. Clara, an experienced and skilled sailor, took the helm, working frantically to adjust the sails and guide the vessel through the gathering storm. She yelled instructions to Julian, but her voice was swallowed by the howling wind. Julian, meanwhile, remained below deck, his mind consumed by a dark, desperate calculation. He knew that if the boat returned to harbor, his life as a wealthy, respected man was over. He knew that Clara was the only obstacle standing between him and the $40 billion empire. He stared at the dark water leaking through the seals, and in the midst of the howling wind and crashing waves, a horrific, dark plan solidified in his mind. He would let the sea solve his problem. According to the official report Julian gave to the Coast Guard 18 hours later, a massive rogue wave struck the starboard side of the vessel, knocking him unconscious against the bulkheads below deck. He claimed that when he finally regained consciousness hours later, the storm had passed, the boat's electrical systems were dead, and Clara had vanished from the deck. He pointed to her orange life vest, which he had found floating in the dark water, as proof that she had been swept overboard. His eyes were red, his voice shaking with a performance of grief that fooled the local authorities completely. The search and rescue team spent 5 long days scouring thousands of square miles of the cold, unforgiving Atlantic, but they found absolutely nothing. No body, no clothing, no sign of life. Clara Vance was officially declared lost at sea, a tragic victim of a sudden, unpredictable ocean storm. Julian returned to the mainland, putting on a grand show of devastating grief for the local press, giving tearful interviews while privately celebrating his newfound security. He was confident that his dark secret was now buried at the bottom of the ocean. When the local sheriff arrived at the stone mansion to deliver the tragic news to Arthur, the old man did not shed a single tear in front of his son. He simply stood by the large glass window, looking out at the gray, freezing Atlantic Ocean, his face as cold and unyielding as the stone walls of his home. He nodded quietly, thanked the sheriff for his service, and retreated to his private study. He did not yell, he did not cry, he simply entered the silence. For 3 straight days, the heavy oak door remained locked, and no sound emerged from within. Julian, believing his father was completely broken by the loss of his favorite child, began quietly celebrating. He assumed that he was now the undisputed, sole heir to the Vance fortune. He began making plans to take over the company, liquidate the conservative land holdings, and launch his global real estate brand, confident that the path was finally clear. But Julian did not understand the true nature of his father. Arthur was not weeping, he was calculating. He had never trusted Julian's story, knowing Clara's exceptional skills as a sailor and Julian's history of deception. He quietly hired a highly specialized, elite private investigation firm from Switzerland to conduct a parallel, completely secret inquiry into the sinking of the Meridian, keeping the investigation entirely out of the local police's hands. Within 6 months, the Swiss investigators presented Arthur with a devastating file. They had discovered that Julian had quietly purchased a massive, multi-million-dollar life insurance policy on Clara just 3 weeks before the sailing trip. More importantly, they recovered a hidden backup of Clara's digital audit files from a secure external server she had set up in Zurich. Arthur now had the absolute, undeniable proof that his son was not only a thief who had stolen millions from the family company, but a man who had willingly sacrificed his sister to protect his own greed. Arthur sat in his dark study, looking at the evidence of his son's ultimate betrayal. He realized that a simple police investigation would be too clean, too quick a punishment for what Julian had done. If Julian went to prison, he would still have access to lawyers, appeal processes, and the remnants of his wealth. Arthur wanted a deeper, more poetic form of justice. He wanted to construct a brilliant, invisible trap that would allow Julian to build his dream world, only to watch it collapse into ashes at the very moment he thought he had won. He would let Julian hang himself with his own rope. Over the next 22 years, Arthur played the part of a fragile, aging father who was slowly losing his grip on the business. He allowed Julian to take over as the chief executive officer of Vance Holdings, watching quietly as his son began expanding the business aggressively. Julian felt invincible. He took out massive, high-interest loans from international investment banks, using the family's historic New England land holdings as collateral to build luxury skyscrapers and glitzy hotels in major cities. But what Julian did not know was that every single one of those major investment banks was actually being controlled or bought out behind the scenes by a highly complex network of offshore shell companies based in Zurich, Switzerland. Under the guidance of Dr. Hans Meyer, Arthur's trusted estate attorney, These shell companies quietly bought up Julian's corporate debt, consolidating it into a single, massive financial leverage point. Arthur was slowly purchasing his son's liabilities, becoming his main creditor without Julian ever realizing it. Every time Julian bought a flashy new yacht, purchased a multi-million-dollar penthouse, or boasted about his growing net worth to the media, Arthur's secret trust was quietly tightening the financial noose. Julian was living a life of absolute luxury on borrowed time and borrowed money, completely unaware that his father actually owned every single asset he claimed as his own. He was building his empire on sand, and Arthur held the water that would wash it away. To keep up his lavish lifestyle and pay the massive interest on his debts, Julian repeatedly tried to access Arthur's private, offshore accounts. But Arthur always refused, citing the need to keep the family's core wealth safe from market volatility. Julian's frustration grew into a burning, silent rage. He watched his father grow older and weaker, counting down the days until the old man's heart would finally stop, viewing Arthur's eventual passing as his ultimate financial salvation, completely unaware of the devastating surprise waiting for him. The day after Arthur's quiet, private funeral, Julian walked into the prestigious law offices of Vance & Associates in Boston. He wore a perfectly tailored black suit, an expensive watch, and a look of quiet, smug triumph. He was finally the king. He was finally going to receive the key to the $40 billion kingdom he had waited over 2 decades to inherit. The crown was finally his, and he was ready to wear it. Sitting around the massive, polished mahogany conference table were the company's senior partners, the board of directors, and a quiet, distinguished older gentleman in a dark charcoal suit who introduced himself as Dr. Hans Meyer, the lead trustee of the Vanguard Trust, based in Zurich. The atmosphere in the room was thick with anticipation, the lawyers whispering among themselves. Dr. Meyer did not offer any words of condolence. He simply opened a vintage leather-bound folder and pulled out a sleek, modern digital ledger screen, displaying complex financial trust codes. He looked directly at Julian and began to read the final terms of Arthur Vance's estate, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. To my son, Julian Vance, I leave the sum of $1 and the immediate, unconditional demand for the repayment of $45 million in corporate funds embezzled in the year 1996. The room fell into a suffocating, freezing silence. Julian's smug smile shattered. He stood up so fast his heavy leather chair scraped violently against the hardwood floor, echoing loudly in the high-ceilinged room. "This is an absolute joke. My father was not in his right mind when he wrote this. I am the sole biological heir to this family, and I will tie this up in probate court for the next 30 years. Dr. Meyer remained completely calm, not even looking up from his files. He pressed a button on the digital ledger, displaying a series of legally binding signatures and corporate debt holdings. Mr. Vance, you do not understand the situation. The Vanguard Trust does not just hold your father's cash. It holds the debt of your entire corporate empire. Your skyscrapers, your homes, your bank accounts. They are all currently collateral for loans owned entirely by this trust. If you attempt to contest this document, we will initiate immediate foreclosure proceedings on every single asset you own within 24 hours. Julian felt the air leave his lungs. He slowly sank back into his chair, his hands trembling as he stared at the glowing blue screen. Dr. Meyer then turned the screen to display the final, most shocking clause of the document. The entire $42 billion estate, including the full ownership of Vance Holdings, has been left to the sole remaining beneficiary of the Vanguard Trust, Clara Vance. Julian stared at the screen, his face completely pale, his chest heaving. Clara? Clara is dead. She has been dead for over 20 years. You cannot leave a global empire to a ghost. Dr. Meyer raised an eyebrow, his expression cool and unyielding. According to the terms of your father's trust, Clara Vance has been designated as the active, living beneficiary. However, your father was a practical man. He understood that she has been absent from public life for a very long time. Therefore, he inserted a specific, non-negotiable clause. Dr. Meyer read from the glowing screen, his voice cutting through the silent room like a knife. If Clara Vance does not personally appear at this office to claim the assets, sign the trust documents, and take active control of the Vanguard Trust within exactly 30 days of my passing, the entire $42 billion estate will be immediately liquidated. Every asset will be sold, and the entire fortune will be permanently donated to a network of international maritime rescue charities. You, Julian, will be left with nothing but your outstanding debts. The trap had officially snapped shut. Julian had exactly 30 days to find the sister he had tried to erase over 2 decades ago, or face complete, catastrophic financial ruin. If he found her, she would control the fortune, but he might be able to negotiate a settlement to save his skin. If he failed to find her, he would be completely bankrupt, stripped of his luxury homes, his cars, and his corporate status, facing the very real possibility of federal prison for his past financial crimes. Julian walked out of the law office into the freezing rain, his mind spinning in a chaotic storm of panic and desperation. He had spent his entire life running from the shadow of his sister's memory, and now his survival depended entirely on finding her alive. He immediately returned to his estate and called the only man who could help him, Marcus, a ruthless, highly connected private investigator who specialized in finding high-profile individuals who had vanished from the face of the earth. Marcus arrived at Julian's estate within 2 hours. He was a tall, quiet man with sharp, analytical eyes and a reputation for using any means necessary to get results. Julian paced frantically across the thick rug of his library, pouring himself glass after glass of scotch as he explained the impossible, terrifying terms of his father's will. Marcus listened in complete silence, taking notes in a small black book. When Julian finally finished speaking, Marcus looked up, his expression grim. "You're asking me to find a woman who was declared dead by the Coast Guard 22 years ago in the middle of a major Atlantic storm. If she's actually dead, Julian, there's nothing to find. You're chasing a ghost, and your 30 days are ticking away." "She's not dead," Julian shouted, his voice cracking with desperation. "My father wouldn't have built this entire trust if she was gone. He was too smart, too calculated. He knew something. He had to have known she survived. You need to find out where he went, who he spoke to, and where he hid her." Marcus agreed to take the case, demanding a massive, 6-figure retainer to begin the search immediately. His team of elite digital investigators began by targeting Arthur Vance's personal travel and financial records over the last 2 decades. They bypassed traditional banking privacy laws, tracing the flow of Arthur's personal cash withdrawals and private travel bookings. Within 48 hours, they discovered a highly irregular, recurring pattern. Every single year, on the exact anniversary of Clara's disappearance in the late summer, Arthur would book a private charter flight from Maine to a tiny, remote island in the Grenadines called St. Jude. He would travel alone, carry no luggage, and stay for exactly 48 hours before returning to the United States. More importantly, Marcus discovered that the small, secluded stone cottage Arthur stayed in on the island was not registered under his name. It was owned by a mysterious, highly private offshore entity called the Meridian Trust, registered in the Cook Islands. The pieces of the puzzle were finally beginning to fit together. Julian realized with a sudden, freezing jolt of adrenaline that his sister had not drowned in the cold waters of the Atlantic. She had been hidden away in a tropical paradise, waiting for the day her father's grand design would finally be set in motion. With only 15 days remaining on the legal countdown, Julian and Marcus boarded a private charter jet, flying south toward the warm, tropical waters of the Caribbean. The contrast between the cold, gray cliffs of Maine and the bright, glittering turquoise waters of the Grenadines was staggering, but Julian felt no appreciation for the beauty around him. His mind was a dark, twisting maze of anxiety, anger, and fear. They landed on a small dirt runway on the main island and immediately hired a private speedboat to take them to the remote shores of St. Jude. The island was a tiny, uninhabited paradise, surrounded by sharp coral reefs and covered in dense, tropical vegetation. There were no luxury resorts, no tourists, and no roads, only a single, narrow dirt path leading up from the secluded rocky harbor into the hills. As the boat pulled up to the weathered wooden dock, Julian's heart pounded violently against his ribs.
Ow.
He felt as if he were walking into a trap, but he had no choice. He had to see this through to the very end. He and Marcus walked slowly up the winding dirt path, the heavy, humid air filling their lungs as the sound of the ocean faded behind them, replaced by the deep, heavy silence of the jungle. At the top of the hill, hidden behind a dense wall of tropical palms, sat a small, beautiful stone cottage. It was built from local volcanic rock, with large glass windows that looked out over the vast, uninterrupted expanse of the Caribbean Sea. It was a place of absolute peace, quiet, and isolation. The perfect sanctuary for someone who wanted to disappear from the world entirely. Julian approached the heavy wooden door of the cottage, his hand trembling as he reached out to knock. Before his knuckles could touch the wood, the door swung open with a quiet creak. Julian froze, his breath catching in his throat as he found himself standing face to face with the woman who had haunted his dreams for over 2 decades. It was Clara. She was no longer the quiet, insecure young girl he had known in the 1990s. She was an elegant, powerful woman in her early 50s. Her dark, wavy hair touched with silver at the temples. Her sharp hazel eyes were calm, intelligent, and completely devoid of fear. She was wearing a simple white linen dress, holding a tablet displaying a complex financial spreadsheet. She looked at Julian with a cool, detached expression, as if she had been expecting him to walk through that door for 20 years. "Hello, Julian," she said, her voice smooth, steady, and completely calm. "You're a few days later than I expected. I thought Marcus's team would have found the flight records much faster." Julian stared at her, utterly speechless. The sheer reality of her survival hit him like a physical blow. He reached out, almost wanting to touch her to see if she was real. You're alive," he whispered, his voice shaking. "How?" "I saw the boat go under. I saw your life vest in the water." Clara smiled a small, cold smile. "You saw what you wanted to see, Julian. You wanted to believe I was gone, because it was the only way you could sleep at night. But you forgot that I knew the Meridian better than anyone. I knew every secret compartment, every backup system, and every safety protocol. And more importantly, I knew exactly who you were. I knew what you were capable of." She stepped back, inviting them inside the cool stone interior of the cottage. The room was simple but elegantly furnished, with walls lined with books on international law, global finance, and marine biology. On a large mahogany desk sat a secure, satellite-connected computer terminal, displaying the real-time financial data of the Vanguard Trust. Clara sat down behind the desk, looking at her brother with a sense of complete, unyielding authority. "You see, Julian, I discovered your embezzlement 3 weeks before our little sailing trip, but I also discovered that you had purchased a massive life insurance policy on my life. I knew that if I confronted you in the office, you would do something desperate. So, I made a call to Arthur." Clara leaned forward, her eyes locking onto Julian's with a chilling intensity. "Arthur and I spent 2 weeks planning my disappearance. We knew that if we simply went to the police, you would hire the best lawyers, tie the company up in legal battles, and drag our family name through the mud. Arthur wanted a clean slate. He wanted you to believe you had won, so you would spend the next 2 decades exposing every single one of your financial vulnerabilities." She explained that on the night of the storm, she had quietly slipped off the boat as it neared a prearranged coordinate near a small, private island reef. A highly specialized rescue team, hired privately by Arthur, had been waiting in the dark waters with an inflatable boat, pulling her to safety while Julian was below deck, pretending to be unconscious. The floating life vest Julian had found in the water was a deliberate plant, designed to give him the perfect, tragic story to tell the local authorities. Arthur had quietly arranged for Clara to be relocated to this remote island, giving her a new identity, unlimited financial resources, and the complete control over his growing offshore networks. For 22 years, Clara had lived a life of absolute freedom, peace, and intellectual stimulation, watching from her computer screen as Julian built his fragile, debt-ridden real estate empire. She had been the quiet hand behind the Swiss shell companies, slowly buying up his debt, waiting for the exact moment Arthur's heart would finally stop so they could spring the ultimate trap. Julian felt a wave of absolute fury wash over him, his face turning red as his fists clenched. You and Arthur ruined my life. You let me live a lie for over 20 years, watching me work, watching me build, just to take it all away from me at the very end. You are monsters. Clara did not flinch. Her voice remained ice cold. We didn't ruin your life, Julian. You ruined it yourself the moment you decided that your own sister's life was worth $45 million. You built your entire empire on a foundation of theft, lies, and betrayal. We simply allowed the laws of gravity to do their work. The debt has officially come due. Clara pulled a thick, white document folder from her desk drawer and placed it in front of Julian. It was the final, non-negotiable agreement prepared by the Zurich trustees. You have exactly two choices, Julian, Clara said, her voice turning cold and professional. Choice number one, you sign this document. You will agree to immediately resign from all corporate positions, relinquish every single share of Vance Holdings, and transfer all your personal assets to the Vanguard Trust to settle your outstanding debts. In return, the trust will pay off your personal creditors, protect you from public bankruptcy, and provide you with a modest monthly allowance of $3,000 to live a quiet, simple life in a small town of your choosing. Julian's eyes widened in horror, his hands shaking. $3,000? That wouldn't even cover the insurance on one of my cars. What is choice number two? Clara looked at him with a flat, unyielding gaze, her eyes showing no mercy. Choice number two, you refuse to sign. You walk out of this door, return to the United States, and within 48 hours, the Vanguard Trust will initiate immediate foreclosure proceedings on every single asset you own. Your banks will freeze your accounts, your homes will be seized, and the Swiss trustees will hand over the complete, unredacted file of your 1996 embezzlement and insurance fraud to the federal authorities. You will be completely bankrupt, publicly humiliated, and spending the next 20 years of your life in a federal penitentiary. Julian turned to Marcus, his eyes pleading for help, but the private investigator simply looked away, packing up his notepad. Marcus was a professional. He knew when a game was completely over. There was no leverage, no loophole, and no way out of the trap Arthur and Clara had spent over 2 decades constructing. The board was cleared, and Julian was in checkmate. Julian stared down at the documents, his hands shaking so violently he could barely hold the pen. The realization of his complete, absolute defeat settled over him like a suffocating blanket. He had spent his entire life running from his father's quiet, silent wisdom, chasing the loud, glittering heights of global wealth, only to be completely destroyed by the very silence he had despised. With a trembling hand, Julian Vance signed his name on the final line of the document, relinquishing his claim to the empire he had spent his entire life trying to steal. He had lost his wealth, his status, his pride, and his family, leaving him with nothing but the cold, bitter knowledge that his father had outsmarted him from beyond the grave. Julian returned to the United States a ghost of his former self. His luxury cars were sold, his penthouses were liquidated, and he was relocated to a small, quiet coastal cottage in Oregon, living on the modest allowance provided by the sister he had tried to destroy. The high society crowds he had spent his life trying to impress immediately forgot his name, leaving him to live out his days in absolute obscurity and regret. He spent his afternoons sitting on the porch, watching the cold Pacific tide come in, wondering how a man with $40 billion could end up with so little. Clara remained on her island, managing the massive $42 billion Vanguard Trust with the same quiet, disciplined intelligence she had inherited from Arthur. The Vance fortune remains completely silent, operating in the deep shadows of the global financial system, far beyond the reach of greed, proving that true power does not need to make noise to rule the world. What do you think about Arthur's ultimate grand design? Did Julian deserve to lose everything, or did a father's silent lesson go too far? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below as we read every single one of them. If you appreciated this high-stakes family story, make sure to show your support by hitting the like button and subscribing to the channel so you never miss our upcoming documentaries. Thank you for watching, and we will see you in the next story.